So I thought I'd be the first Hoosier to make absinthe in the state of Indiana. I found out later that I was wrong about that. It wasn't something that a craft distiller was willing to do and pull off as being the first, but something that already existed within the state. So my name's Alan Bishop. I'm a craft distiller. I tend to identify myself as the alchemist of the Black Forest of Indiana, and I'm very passionate about absinthe. And for those who don't know what absinthe is, it's sort of a plant elixir, an alcohol-based plant elixir, very similar to a tincture, very similar to sparyadric medicine. So it has its first real roots as being a distilled product in Culpeper's Complete Herbal from the 1600s. And you could probably find roots that would tie it back to the Salerno school in Italy as well, going back a few centuries before that. But as the product we know as absinthe, its real tradition is from the Val di Travers in the Swiss Alps. And it was a tradition passed down by women, what you might think of as physicians, or some people might call them hedge witches, who were playing around with different types of botanicals for various different physical ailments, that was later turned into a commercialized product that got a very bad rap based on the wine industry at one point in time, claiming that it was a poison. So the base botanicals for absinthe are going to be Artemisia absinthium, so grand wormwood, as well as fennel and anise. So the Sicilies as they were, those were plants that grew commonly in the Swiss Alps, or were able to be brought into the Swiss Alps pretty easily. Absinthe has got an entirely different sort of effect physiologically. It actually triggers the part of your brain that recognizes food and not alcohol, and causes some very unique effects because of the botanicals. And no, tripping is not one of those effects, but very much lucidity is an effect of absinthe, which is why the artist preferred it. You can't have 3 or 4 glasses of whiskey and paint a painting, but you can have 3 or 4 glasses of absinthe and be inspired to do something very, very unique. So my specific history with absinthe, I've been a distiller most of my life. I grew up in a distilling family of moonshiners, as well as a farmer. So I've always been around different medicinal botanicals. And I think like any kid that was born in the 80s or 90s, you probably saw absinthe romanticized in various different ways, whether it be through Bram Stoker's Dracula or various other forms of media, sometimes portrayed correctly and sometimes incorrectly. So there's a romanticism about that that got me involved in it and wanting to make it, and I've always thought of it as something very difficult to distill. I was lucky enough to get hired on at Copper & King's American Brandy Company about a decade ago and helped lay out the absinthe there at their particular distillery. It's really a little bit more like Ozu, but it was a foot in the door for absinthe. And from there, I just sort of took a deep dive, went very heavy into the production of absinthe, both on a hobbyist level as well as on a professional level. And then at Spirits of French Lick produced a true Swiss Blanche Le Bleu style absinthe there, and have developed various multiple other commercial absinthes, particularly for a client in Key West, Florida. So it's very much a passion and a hobby of mine. I consider absinthe to be sort of the distiller's thesis. It's kind of the thing that you have to do to make a true Swiss or a French style absinthe. It's almost a solid state distillation to prove that you're a true distiller, in my opinion. And it's the one botanical spirit that sort of wavers back and forth between being something for actually imbibing or being something that's more of a tincture or a medicine. So I came across a history book about the history of Switzerland County, Indiana, and being a proper Southern Hoosier as it was, I came across 2 references to absinthe distillers in Switzerland County, Indiana in the 1830s. This is before absinthe is really even a mainline product in France at the time. I mean, there's people drinking it, but it's not a super common thing except on a local level in the 1830s. So to find 2 absinthe producers in Switzerland County that were apparently large enough that they had to have their own cooper to make barrels to send the product downriver, down the Ohio River to New Orleans presumably, was pretty interesting. And one of the things that we had to go off of in this particular history book was that they said that when they got here, they had already found wormwood growing abundantly. We don't believe that that was grand wormwood, but we'll get into that as we go. But they were certainly making something that they considered a absinthe, and they were from the right region in Europe to be making absinthe, absolutely. So the goal here was talking to Brian Cushing, can we recreate an absinthe that would have been something similar to what was being made in Switzerland County, Indiana in the 1830s, and would be representative of a true Hoosier-style absinthe from that time period that nobody's tasted since the 1830s. And then to be able to have a place like Vinoge where we could come and actually have the atmosphere to enjoy a glass of absinthe that we made using yeast from the local area and using the methods of that time, that's pretty special.
Well, we're called Switzerland County because our first settlers who kind of came with a business plan came from Vevey, Switzerland, which is in the canton of Vaud. And in 1802, they came to Switzerland County to start vineyards. They actually started out in Jessamine County, Kentucky first though, and they started a first vineyard there. And it was successful for a while, but then part of the group had come over here, and what they were discovering is this was more suitable, and a lot of the vines that they had planted were not doing well there, but they learned what two varieties, the Cape and the Madeira, did well here. And so through an act of Congress in 1802, they were granted land on credit. And so John Jacques Dufour is the one who is leading this whole deal to get the land. And so 2,500 acres were acquired by credit, and then additional 1,200 that they purchased. Now the land that they had started on the east side of Vevey, which is Hunts Creek, and goes to the west side of Vevey, which is Indian Creek. And so that's where the land lay. And that is what eventually became the town of Vevey. Now, they first called the land New Switzerland, and a few families were here to begin with, and then as things were going well, they sent word and more people came, and it really started to develop a community. They started out with just about 900 residents before they actually started to plat the town. And so in 1813 is when Vevey became an actual community, and 1814 is when it became a county. Now the vineyards did pretty well for a while, but then it's like the next generation doesn't want to continue what the families had started. And then we have heard that and read that distilleries started becoming the more popular way to make alcoholic beverages. And so the grapes kind of went by the wayside.
All right, so I'm here in Switzerland County with Judy Kappas, who's a Switzerland County resident, and she's here to tell us a little bit about the history of the people who came here who were eventually producing absinthe. And we are at a beautiful crossroads within the county, and we just happen to be within walking distance of what we now believe may have been the home site and potentially the distillery site associated with one of the two absinthe distillers that we know about. Judy, I had come across a write-up about Switzerland County history, and that, you know, it was talking about absinthe being produced here in 1830, which is long before it was in vogue throughout Europe. Just really a small area in the Jura, the Val di Travers, northern France, etc. And so to find it in southern Indiana in 1830 is pretty unique, but there were two names associated with that absinthe. And so Brian and I came to you looking for information, and you had some information regarding one of those absinthe producers and the fact that we're standing probably within very close walking distance of where he produced that absinthe, which is pretty special.
The gentleman we're talking about is Griffith Dickason, D-I-C-K-A-S-O-N. And in a lot of the books and the information in the county, he's listed as Griffey, because that's what they called him. So, and he was my ancestor. Well, Griffith Dickason came from Kentucky, came up the Kentucky River in 1798. And he got to the Ohio River, and he took a right and came to Indian Creek, which is just west of Vevey. And from there, he came up the creek and he found this spot of land here in this valley. And a friend of his, Stillwell Hetty, was interested in settling here, and Stillwell was still in Kentucky. But of course, when people settled these lands, there was nothing here. So they had to build something to live in for their family before they moved the family here. And the Swiss came about 1802 or 3, somewhere thereabouts. And the government was involved in letting the Swiss have a bunch of land, Vevey and east of Vevey. And a lot of the people who were squatting on those lands on the east side of Vevey lost their places. So Stillwell and Griffith went to Cincinnati, to the Cincinnati Land Company, and they bought a half section of land here in Jefferson Township. and Section 2 in September, I think it was, of 1803. So Griffith ended up with the southwest corner of the property, and Stillwell took the northwest part of the property. They each had 160 acres, and the creek flows through both of them.
Well, it was very interesting when we were driving up here today, or down here as it were, because we had come up and then back down. I was remarking to my friend Justin that I can see why they settled here, because I've not obviously been to the Val di Traverse or Jura, but I've done a lot of research, and from the pictures, they settled in places that reminded them of home.
Right.
And I could see how this would remind them of home.
Most definitely.
And it was interesting too, reading through and finding in those articles that there was wormwood growing here when they got here. Well, we know that grand wormwood is not native here, but there are a number of wormwood species that are native here, and no sooner than we parked our vehicles when we got here, as soon as we stepped out of the truck, there was an annual Artemisia growing right next to the truck. So we're clearly in the right environment for the botanicals that would be used in absinthe production, and the fact that they're still growing here is very impressive. When we first got here, and you got us permission to come on this piece of property, and we pulled up, we found the Artemisia plant that we were talking about. You sort of had printed off some maps for us and gave us some information, and looking at them, being a researcher of old distillers, first thing I do is look at the topography, and I go, well, there's spring here, spring here, spring here, spring here. These are the likely places, and then avoid sort of developed farmland. We were lucky enough when we started walking the property to find some really cool things that we could tell were associated with human history. So on the right-hand side, as we were walking down along the hillside, there was a terraced area that we could sort of tell there used to be a house there, and definitely gardens. And as we walked up that, we started finding various pieces of glass, so various pieces of plates and various pieces of patent medicine bottles, etc. And then just up from it, there was a little spring by what's now a deer camp in that same area. And as a distiller, it makes sense to have your distillery close to your house, so you can keep an eye on your wares and keep things under control, etc. So we think that's probably the best possibility of where it might have been at. But secondarily, on this creek is beautiful. It's limestone water, it's well filtered, it's deep. I'm sure it stays cool even in the hottest months of the year. It stayed cold enough to keep a condenser cold. Probably if it was on the creek, it would have been associated with a mill in particular. I would have expected, because that's the way most distilleries were. They were mills and distilleries at the same time. So I
know there was a mill at this next piece of property next door. I know that for a fact, because it's written up in the history where it was at.
Well, I know this. I know we're on the right piece of property. I know we had somebody nice enough and kind enough to guide us here. For once in my career studying distilling history, I've not been shot at today, which is wonderful. And I know that we have gone out of our way today to also try to capture some yeast that we'll use to produce some absinthe in the future as well.
Good.
So that's going to be a very important part of the story overall, I think.
Sounds interesting. Great.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
All right. And if you go that way underneath that dead branch and follow the creek, it'll take you to Vinoge.
All right, so I'm here at Musée de Vinoge with Donna Weaver, correct? And this was a pretty unique place to be able to come to be able to start on our absinthe project. So Donna, can you tell us a little bit about this house and the history here in the area?
This was a farm starting in 1828. It was built by Jacob and Charlotte Weaver. They farmed here. They had regular farm animals. He flatboated, and he was a vintner also. Although he didn't grow his grapes here, he grew them over on Plum Creek. But he had the regular farm animals, the regular crops. He flatboated to New Orleans, but he made his living any way he can.
And I noticed that you have a beautiful garden that kind of fits the era of that time with some of the specific botanicals that we're interested in for absinthe, such as wormwood and hyssop and basil and mints.
Yes, we do.
And those were all common things that were being grown in this area?
Right, and we use them for medicinals also. So there's a lot of uses for these wonderful herbs.
Yeah, and do you think those botanicals, were they also being brought over by the early settlers as well, because those are things they were familiar with in the old country too?
Yes, and of course on the East Coast. You know, the Weavers were from, Jacob Weaver was from New York State, so I was quite popular and quite civilized a lot earlier than southern Indiana.
Yeah, so they would have been certainly familiar with all the medicinal aspects
absolutely.
of those botanicals and what they were capable of. So
Yes.
very neat. Well, let's take a look at your garden if you want to.
Absolutely.
You have a number of absinthe-based plants, including Artemisia absinthium or grand wormwood, as well as some apple mint, and mint of various types was also used in absinthe. So
Yes.
the interesting thing about all these medicinal plants that do go into absinthe is that they tend to have an effect on one's stomach, particularly settling somebody's stomach if they're having any sort of problems in that area. So of course wormwood, we know from the name, is good for worms, which, you know, common parasite way back when.
Yes.
So hopefully not as much anymore nowadays, but we have absinthe to fix the problem if that is the case. So today I was curious, I have brought some things to capture some yeast. So this is what would be called a yeast trap. So this is basically a corn mash, and the reason I'm using corn as opposed to wine, and I know that Vivi was very responsible for commercial wine making with Catawba grape, we figured they probably wouldn't have used Catawba brandy for their absinthe because it would have
No.
been too expensive for what they could have sold it for as wine. So I figure corn whiskey is what they were going with. So we like to use the same base to capture our yeast as what we're actually going to use to ferment. So Donna, back in the Swiss Alps, absinthe was something that was shared amongst what they called the Henriot sisters, and they weren't really sisters; they were more of a sisterhood. So they were kind of the hedge witches or granny witches of their time, and this was something that was very sacred to them. So I'd like to ask you, if you would, to actually take some of the botanicals and help me start this yeast.
I'd be delighted, sir. We'll get that bug off of there first.
What are some of the other plants here that you're very excited about?
Well, I'm terribly excited about Dame's Rocket. It's an invasive. However, it's been an invasive for over 300 years, but it's a beautiful plant.
Beautiful invasive.
Yes, and we have basil, we've got sage, we have my lady's bedstraw, which is a dye plant. We've got parsley, we've got coriander, we have comfrey, we have hyssop, we have feverfew, we've got all kinds. And we use them for food, we use them for medicinals, and we use them in that.
So I guess my next question for you would be, where's your still at?
We don't have a still.
You don't have a still? I mean, every
No.
home a distillery, right?
Not this one.
Well, would you happen to know where I could find one?
Yes, I do.
My name is Brian Cushing. At the time we started this project, I was the program director at Historic Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky, which is the home of the early 19th century small farm distillery project. And as program director, I was lucky enough to be able to play a lead role in developing that project. Basically, it was my job to figure out how this thing was going to work and then how we were going to make that happen. And it was one of the neatest things I ever did in my life. So Locust Grove is a circa 1792 historic home and farm in East Louisville, Kentucky. Back in those days, it was out in Jefferson County. And its claim to fame was it was the last home of George Rogers Clark, but it was owned by William Cron. And again, we have 55 acres left of the original farm that was almost 700 acres. And so one of the hard things about interpreting the story there is interpreting the farm itself, because that's not actually where the owner, William Cron's, money was coming from. It was a general farm. They didn't have a cash crop. But one of the most exciting clues that we got was he was involved in the purchase of a 66-gallon still in 1808 with his brother-in-law, Owen Gwathmey. And it wasn't really a surprise because we knew they grew grain, and we knew they had fruit orchards, and so it stood to reason that they would have been preserving some of that crop through fermentation and distillation, just like everybody else was at that time. But there we had the smoking gun, and we commenced to try to figure out what this was, to recreate this early 19th century Kentucky distillery. We were not and are not licensed to distill, but everything down there is real, and so we do as much as we can. We go through the whole mashing process for real. We never fake anything. Okay, we're trying to we're trying to understand as much as we possibly can, and when possible, then that mash gets shipped off to a licensed distillery where they handle the fermentation and distillation. In this case, it was Kentucky Artisan Distillery, who had been great partners. And so we opened We opened this in 2017, and on opening weekend, I met Alan Bishop. Alan and Old Dale Bishop came down to opening weekend and immediately became part of the project. Alan just started to contribute his knowledge, his expertise, and took us to places that we would have never gone without him. And one of the things he brought up to me that year in 2017 was this research he had been doing on the absinthe that was produced in Switzerland County, Indiana in the 1830s, and asked, would we like to partner on that? And that was a no-brainer for me. Yes, absolutely. I thought absinthe was fascinating and never thought I would find an excuse to try to do that, to try to work with that at Locust Grove. And so we started talking about it then. We really started to work in earnest on it in 2020. And so our part of that was that we handled the mashing process. We made the mash for the base spirit there in the distillery in the same way it would have been done 200 years ago. We did it the same way that we do any whiskey mash, which we had done quite a few of by that point. And I have to say too that Brooks Grains donates all of the grain for Locust Grove's whiskey mashing projects. They were really generous to us, came on board, wanted to be a part of this historic discovery. And so the work starts the day before. We've got to measure out the grain at that point. We do about 100 gallons of mash at a time, and that's over 2 standard 53-gallon bourbon barrels. Now, a lot of times there was all different sizes of barrels at that time, but the standard bourbon barrel, the 53 gallons, is actually very convenient for us because that's about how much mash would have gone into that still. And so we're actually able to do a single run in a standard bourbon barrel. And so we have to measure out the grain per barrel. So per 50 to 53 gallons, we do 70 pounds of corn, 8 pounds, 6 ounces of wheat, and 8 pounds, 6 ounces of barley malt. That is a formula that Alan Bishop brought to us, which was quite a refinement over the recipe I had written. I think it probably would have worked, but his was quite a bit better. And so that's what we used. When we're doing a whiskey mash, we actually do also throw in some oats because one of the only grains that we have record of being grown at Locust Grove is oats. There just wasn't much in the way of farm records kept down there because it wasn't the bread and butter of the income. So we measure all that out. We soak the barrels for the next day. They have to be swelled up. A barrel is basically like a living, breathing creature. It's expanding and contracting, and those hoops can be moving up and down throughout the year. So we fill it with water, we check where the leaks are, we see where it needs to be tightened up, and we get that in good shape the day before. So once we stop those leaks, then we just let it sit and soak so that it's watertight the next day. When we get down there, there's a lot of work to do before we even get started. We've got a very big copper boiler, and it's gonna verdigris, okay? In between, I don't care if you leave it for one day, there's gonna be cleaning that has to be done. We gotta scrub that verdigris out because that can distill through. And so that's the first thing we do. We do fill the still up with water, and we build a fire under it for 2 reasons. One thing, aesthetically, it's very nice for the image that the public is seeing. And also we realized at one point, since we have this big copper vessel that we're not using for anything else, it's a handy way to also sanitize our tools as the day goes on, because we want to keep everything as clean as possible so that the only thing that grows in there is what we want to grow in there. So we fire those up. And once that boiler gets to a rolling boil, that's when the real action, the real fun starts. The first thing we mash is the corn. The corn and that rolling, boiling water go in together. And so there's 3 jobs that happens at that point. We've got the guy pouring the corn. We've got somebody stirring to keep everything agitated, try to not to get too many clumps. And then we have several people carrying buckets of water, of that boiling water from the boiler into the barrel. Usually, by the time it's nearly full and that 70 pounds of room temperature corn has combined with that boiling water, usually the temperature is about low enough that we can go ahead and introduce that wheat. And so we do that, and we keep that stirring. We try to break up as many clumps as possible because we don't want any of that grainy goodness tied up in a dry clump when it could be helping out with the whiskey. So that goes on until we can lower the temperature of the mash to about a little below 150 degrees. And that's when we put the malt in. And when we put the malt in, you see the whole character of the mash change. What was basically like stirring cornbread batter becomes a very thin, very easily worked with substance. So what we're doing at that point, without diverting the theme of this film into what malt is, when we hold that temperature between 140 and 150 degrees for about an hour, we're fooling it into thinking it's going to make a plant, and that's what releases the starchy goodness that gives the yeast something to eat, that really facilitates that alcohol production. And so after that, for hours, the job is just to stir it, to be sure any clumps are broken up, and to try to get that temperature down to below 95 degrees so that it's safe for the yeast. And of course, the yeast we were using here was what Alan harvested from those actual absinthe botanicals from Vinoge. We didn't really know how this was going to work. We felt pretty good about it, but it was a mystery. It did not get down to 95 degrees before we had to pump it out and take it up to Kentucky Artisan where they were going to distill it. So it was still pretty hot when we pumped it into a tank in the back of my Ford Ranger. Turns out a Ford Ranger is not suitable for hauling 100 gallons of mash down the expressway. But we got it there safely, we got the yeast there safely, and Kentucky Artisan Distillery in Crestwood, Kentucky took it from there.
Kentucky Artisan Distillery. We've been out here in Crestwood, Kentucky since 2012. It was originally a dry county. We had to have a special vote to get it turned wet so our tour center could do tastings. We've really scaled up over the last 10 years, going from about 200-300 barrels a year up till this next year doing about 6,000 barrels a year. So we've been on the small craft side and now moving up into that mid-sized producer. We produce for about 10 different brands right now, bottle for about 15 different companies, and really like to keep our feet in the traditional style while still becoming more efficient with modern technology. So we like to kind of have a blend of both sides together. To take on a big project, partnered up with Locust Grove, we're able to move some history into some modern technology here at Kentucky Artisan Distillery and kind of lend a helping hand to preserve some of the historical methods and ways that a lot of other local distillers used to use, kind of continue that tradition. When we were bringing a lot of the things in, a lot of our checkpoints and things we do for quality control aren't necessarily the same as you do on the shining side, and it's not one's better than the other, but we have different concerns that we have. So when the first couple batches were coming in, we had our quality people and going over it top to bottom and kind of had to relax some of those rules and be willing to deal with new yeast strains, new ways of transporting mash in plastic totes, across city limits, and get it out here so we could do it on the legal side. And I really remember just kind of thinking, man, damn, this would be a lot easier if we could just do it all out at Locust Grove. There's beautiful equipment out there, a lot of things that you would want to do to really keep that historically accurate. And we brought the mash back from Locust Grove. We had a couple of more traditional stills still at our disposal. We had this copper still that's behind me right now. It's original, about 1930s hand-hammered copper, really a good representation of more of the smaller farm-style distilling equipment that would have been available, although this would have been a very large one at the time. For us, it was our smallest piece of equipment. So we tried to use the things that would replicate the older production methods that we could, and that included less cooling equipment, not doing everything with the modern twist to kind of give us that replication of older methods. And then as we progressed through it, we kind of took that same approach where we mirrored the mash bills that were being produced at Locust Grove here in-house so we could put our controls in and just kind of compare them one-to-one and see what we ended up with. So we had the controls versus the ones that were coming from Locust Grove. Flavor-wise, as long as we didn't run into any bacterial issues, we're pretty close, but we found it was a little bit easier to keep our in-house ones clean. So it was fun to be able to compare those two. Final distillation was kind of news to us. It was new mash bills, so as we worked through those, getting those new flavor profiles and really being able to collect them in more of a manner that was, again, time specific, was stoneware, not necessarily barreled or putting it back in glass. We weren't really going for the oak aged products that we usually deal with being a bourbon distillery. So I've got some of the stoneware behind me here. And then it was really just kind of a waiting game, being able to put all that product together, pass it off to Alan and his team over at French Lick, and be able to wait and see what kind of manipulation they were able to do with that down the road.
So what we're going to actually do here today is we are going to begin the process of recreating the traditional Switzerland County, Indiana style of absinthe. And so that's going to be a little bit different than what you read about in history with Belle Epoque style absinthe. So this is in 1830. This is going to be, long before absinthe is really popular anywhere other than the Val de Travers or northern France. It really shouldn't exist as a spirit in the United States at this point in time. So production process is quite a bit different. By the time you get to the Belle Epoque, they're dealing with highly refined spirits. So you're dealing with grape neutral spirits almost, about 170 proof for their maceration process. In Switzerland County, Indiana in 1830, all they really had on hand was a simple copper pot still, a simple alembic still. They're not going to be able to reach that proof and that purity of alcohol. They're probably also not going to be using grapes, even though they were growing grapes at the time, for the base liquor. They're going to be using whatever was cheapest to get a hold of. More than likely, they were using corn for the basic process. So what we have here is basically a corn liquor, or think of it as a moonshine. That's what it smells and tastes like in a lot of ways. That is 80% or 70% corn, 20% wheat, and 10% malt. It's been very similar to what they would have had access to at the time. It's a very strongly flavored base spirit. It's definitely going to shine through in the finished product. So we're going to take a half gallon of that liquor at 132 proof and put it in the alembic, and then bring it up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So you'll notice we're not going to use any thermometers or anything to check that, because we're going to try to stay as historic as what we can, and they wouldn't have had thermometers commonly available to them. So the way they would have checked the temperature is to actually place their hands on the shoulder of the copper alembic, and once you get to 140 on a piece of copper like this, you can just barely put your hand on it, leave it there for a few seconds before it starts to burn a little bit, and that'll let us know the temperature that we need to be at. After that, we're going to grind our botanicals up. We're going to take this liquor at 140 degrees at full proof. We're going to drop it into a glass carboy, and then add our botanicals to that for maceration for 18 to 24 hours before we redistill. And that will give us the base of our absinthe product. So we're going to start weighing out our botanicals, and this is all done in grams per gallon. So as you noticed a while ago when we filled the still with liquor, we only filled it halfway up. This is a 1 gallon still, we put a half gallon in there. And what we want is that high proof ethanol at 132 degrees to begin to actually pull out all of those volatile oils from the botanicals that we're going to use. It's actually the exact opposite of traditional gin production. So with gin production, you use a lower proof ethanol to pull out the oils. You're going for two different things. You're going for very bright flavors in particular. With gin, with absinthe, you're going a little more earthy, a little more rounded, so you want that higher proof. So all the botanicals are measured to a gallon of liquor produced, but go into a half gallon. And what happens is after that maceration happens for 18 to 24 hours, we'll actually open the still back up and we'll proof that liquor the rest of the way down to about 80. You never want to go into a still at more than 80 proof because your explosion risk goes way up. Now, I don't know that that's how they were doing it in the 1830s, but by the Belle Epoque, that's certainly what the common denominator was. So we're going to start with wormwood that was actually harvested from Vinoge. So we're going to grind some botanicals whenever you're ready, buddy.
We're ready.
Oh yeah, that worked out good. We may not. So now we got some green anise. So this is the fennel. All right, this is angelica root. It's going to be a little harder. There's not much of it. If you like this one, it's really easy to grind.
Awesome.
And it smells awesome too.
Which one is this?
Coriander.
For the audience, what are we crushing right now?
Lemon balm.
Lemon balm.
Yep. Which can be used either in the distillation or in the coloration. We're actually going to divide this in half.
Did this come from Locust Grove or Vinoge?
This came from Locust Grove.
Locust Grove. Yeah. This would be the work of Master Gardener Sarah Sutherland.
Yes. Yeah, her stuff's excellent, by the way.
This one?
Mint.
Mint.
Yep.
And is this the Locust Grove mint?
Yes. Yeah. So what's funny is in a lot of the old recipes, they don't. So in the Swiss Alps, they almost always specify peppermint. up until the end of the Belle Epoque, and then it's just mint.
Huh.
And I think they just got to the point where they didn't care. It's just,
Just
whatever
mint.
mint you like. Go ahead. Gonna be the star anise.
Star anise, and we're gonna beat it with a hammer.
Yep. That's the totality of the botanicals that will go into the maceration. What's in there now? So I don't know if you want to show that to the camera. Or... And as you can see, that's that's damn near a half gallon of volume itself. There we go. All right, and because this is hot, I think I'm going to pour it into this first.
It smells amazing.
And so you'll have that much more liquid on top of it before you distill it, because you'll proof it down with water down to about 80 proof.
Gotcha.
The next thing we're going to do is we're going to distill this into our blanche style or white style absinthe, which was incredibly common as well. So Verde came a little later on, but we do know in Switzerland County they were making a Verde, or I'm not sure so I can say it right. It's Vert. Vert. I don't know why I think I got to put the E on the end of it, but I do. But the coloration process basically is once this is distilled, right? Once we've added our water to the still, brought this down to 80 proof, redistilled it, pulled our alcohol off of it, our hearts, our potable alcohol. We're then going to take 42% of that finished distillate, and we are going to add more botanicals to that to give it that beautiful emerald green sort of color. So one of the botanicals we're going to add is hyssop. So this was actually from Musée de Vinoge. Then we're going to add lemon balm, and a close relative of the grand wormwood that we use for absinthe. Grand wormwood has always been, one of the holy trinity, or the holy triumvirate of absinthe botanicals, of wormwood, fennel, and anise. So we're going to add petite wormwood, hyssop, and then also lemon balm or melissa, and that's going to give us some coloration as well as a little bit of a perfume to the finished spirit. Also,
And what was the very appetizing way to refer to the green absinthe? You said they was it pond water?
pond water,
Yeah.
yeah, swamp water, yes,
Swamp water,
yeah,
that was
swamp
it.
water, yeah. That was that's what they tended to call it when it was in this stage in particular, a little boggy there. So.
Well, life happens the way it happens, and it's been 2 years since that last shot you just saw. But obviously, it is done. We're back at Vinoge. Fill us in on what you did to get us here after Amy and I left Spirits of French Lick.
So after you left Spirits of French Lick, we basically took the liquor that we had distilled there, and we macerated, as you saw on the video, as you participated in. We let that set for a couple of weeks and really infuse in that alcohol, because we knew that the chances of them being able to run botanicals in a still at that time without scorching them or burning them in some way, shape, or form was pretty limited. So we had to do what was called a wash. So we were able to let those botanicals macerate a lot longer to pull more of the oils out of them. Then we pressed the botanicals, reclaimed that alcohol, redistilled it with the botanicals in it, made our various different distillers cuts that we were going to use for the finished alcohol, pulled it out, and then we started doing our coloration process with our coloring botanicals, which included lemon balm or melissa, which was very, very common, commonly used for Verde absinthes as well as Swiss Blanche style absinthes. We used a little bit of petite wormwood, we used a little bit of hyssop, and we also used just a hair little bit of spinach because that was common at the time. And so from there, we didn't proof it down or anything. We left the proof ceiling where it was, because traditionally absinthe has been distilled up to and bottled up to the 140s to 150s. But we don't think that they were rectified distilling their base alcohol here in Switzerland County in particular, because it would have taken a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot more resources, and a lot more wood to run the still in particular. So we kept it at that sort of corn liquor proof of the time, which was 125 proof.
Gotcha.
And we do keep it there because absinthe is an extract. That's something a lot of people miss out on. It's not to be drank neat. It's not to be shot like a modern Jägermeister or something of that nature. So here we have 125 proof absinthe that we're going to add water to and luche it. And what that's going to do,
What's luching?
that's basically when you are expressing the oils that are in the absinthe. And what happens is there's so many plant oils in there, because this is, I hate to use the phrase functional alcohol, but somewhat it is functional alcohol. But that alcohol and water mixture can't hold all those oils in suspension, so it's going to cloud or go opalescent for us to some degree. So the luche here isn't going to be crazy heavy like you'll see on a Belle Epoque style. We stuck more to that 1830 style that would have been happening in the Swiss Alps in particular amongst the traditional families that were making it. A little lighter body than what you'd find with the Belle Epoque.
Well, the aroma is just tantalizing.
Oh, it is. That's fascinating.
So one thing that I love about absinthe in particular, whether it's Belle Epoque or earlier style, is there's such an aroma of like pastry that comes across.
You're right.
In particular. And again, it's triggering that part of your brain that recognizes food as opposed to actual alcohol. We did pull the anise and the fennel back on this compared to Belle Epoque stuff, because this was considered more of a bitter sort of thing.
Gotcha.
Right? So we didn't want that anise and that fennel, those heavy decadent Belle Epoque styles to come to the forefront. We wanted something earlier.
Well, we spent all this time talking about it. I think we've gotten to the best part. We've got some representatives from all of the partners in the house ready to taste this stuff. Some of them are absinthe people, some of them aren't, some of them have probably never even tasted this before. So let's get some honest reactions. Ready?
Yeah, right in time. My stomach's
Yes,
a little
sir.
rumbly. All right, so with the process of luching, what's happening is the amount of botanicals that were in that distillation, the oils that have been extracted out of them, they won't stay in suspension within the alcohol and the water matrix. Later on, by the time you get up to the Belle Epoque in particular, you started adding sugar and using these fancy style fountains, these drip fountains, and it was part of the ceremony to actually luche your absinthe, usually 2 to 1 part or 3 to 1 part absinthe, depending upon the proof, with a sugar cube and an absinthe spoon. But that coloration change is what's called a luche. There's also another name for it, it's called saponification, but we don't use that particular term because it doesn't sound delicious. And that's basically, you are creating sort of soap molecules, but in this particular instance, you're not tasting soap because the amount of botanicals and the amount of oil in there, you're getting more of those oils coming to the forefront and bringing perceived sweetness from the anise, the fennel, as well as some of the licorice root. And what I tend to look for, and we're pretty close right there from what I can tell, Brian, we're getting real close. What I tend to look for is I like to leave just a little bitty line of alcohol at the top, so you can see that everything in the glass is pretty much luched and changed to that opalescent color. But at the very top, you'll see a little line of clear looking alcohol, and I leave just a thin little line for mine. Some people like it luched down a little more, some a little less. All right, guys.
All right. Cheers. Cheers.
So as the distiller, I'm not going to give notes until you guys give notes because that's the way that game is played generally. So I'm curious to see what you guys think of it, and if it meets Donna, for example, and any expectation that you might have of, you know, it could be anything from the ephemeral, like, does it sort of seem to represent this county and this place?
I can't speak to that. I can speak to the fact that it's incredibly soft.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know notes, but it's delightful.
Thank you.
It's easily consumed.
Mm-hmm. What do you got, Justin?
I agree. It is soft. The spice that was there prior to luching, definitely gone. I won't say gone. It's kind of there on the back end. Definitely more floral, I think, than other absinthes that I've tried. Then the bitterness is there as well, which I do enjoy.
Well, I remember when we were working on the recipe for this and we were deciding how they probably did it then, which is different than how it's done in the United States. Now, I remember Alan said, we're not going to like this. This is not going to be to modern taste, but it very much is. I think when we first talked about that plan, we thought it was going to be very overpowering. It was going to be a taste that we don't necessarily like, but it's just not, it's full-bodied and smooth. And
I feel like I'm getting spearmint.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that hint. Yeah.
What do you think, bud?
It's not as bitter as I was expecting.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's definitely mellow. It's smooth. I was actually, I'm not a big like black licorice fan, and I actually like this.
Good, good. Yeah, I'm surprised how little the base comes to the forefront, considering that is just corn and wheat was the base alcohol for that. And I think people would have a very hard time finding that corn whiskey underneath of it, for sure, especially as soft as it is. And there's a fruity element to it as well. I think that most people, if they were blind tasting on this, they would tend to think that grape brandy might be the base for it. But it's just that anise and the fennel playing off the bitterness of that wormwood and bringing that fruity sort of characteristic to the forefront. I also think the mouthfeel is really nice. It's soft, but it's also a very creamy sort of mouthfeel that sort of coats everything. It's very oily.
Yeah, creamy is a good term.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't get any bitter at all.
No. The botanicals are definitely not overpowering or.
It's very clean. It's everything feels like it's really well integrated in there. There's not anything just dominating one thing over another. But I keep going back and forth between peppermint and wintergreen. Especially on the mid part.
Yeah, and what that might be, I think we use some mint from Locust Grove that is. It's Locust Grove mint. It hybridized at some point, and it's great for mint juleps. And I think it went really well in this.
No, this is beautiful, man.
It's really smooth. It's really easy to drink, which I like an easier liquor to drink. So no, it's really nice.
Well, we've been at this so long. Raina has taken over what my job was at Locust Grove when we started this project. So, so were you familiar with absinthe before this?
I've had absinthe casually. I've had absinthe with whiskey, which is really nice as well. Of just kind of like dripping over the whiskey. So that's really nice as well. But I haven't had absinthe in its like purest form.
I definitely get the, we added some Melissa, some lemon balm for the coloration in particular, and I think we also did it in the distillation. But I feel like the Melissa from the coloration is coming through much more prominent on the mid palate. I get a lot of that lemon balm, and then I get a little bit of that anethol from the anise. Not real heavy like you get with Belle Epoque later style absinthe. So, but that kind of tongue numbing thing that anethol causes is there on the very tip of the tongue. The bitterness from the wormwood moves to the side. It's there, but it's not overwhelming, and it's wonderful just to be sitting in this house in this county. Drinking this, even if it's not exactly what they made, because we don't know for sure, but going on a hunch and using distiller's instincts, drinking this in the place that it was from in Indiana for us.
And it's so exciting to read about it in Dufour's book about doing what they called pond water. Affectionately pond water.
Pond water, yes. Yeah, that was one of the things that I don't think that we had really mentioned in the movie itself, but maybe worth mentioning here. So if there was any one thing I could differentiate in this particular batch, because so many cool things are happening here. The yeast is actually from your garden. Some of the botanicals from your garden, botanicals from Locust Grove, botanicals from my house, botanicals from Brian and Amy's house. That's all neat stuff. But if you go back and you read in that Switzerland County history book, one of the things they say is that wormwood was abundant. But I don't think it was grand wormwood because it's not native to Indiana. However...
Oh, well... Yeah, you could bring it in. Yeah.
Well, they say it was wild here already in that book.
Okay.
So I suspect what they were using was either annual wormwood or mugwort. So annual wormwood has the same physiological effects that grand wormwood has, but it's ragweed is all it is. And it grows everywhere here.
Yes.
And mugwort's fairly common too. But I would love to make another one of these sometime and switch out grand wormwood for one of those two ingredients and see how that would have affected flavor profile.
Now, one story we do have to tell here, Aiden was the one special invitation to the tasting. He was helping out with the mashing at Locust Grove, but Aiden was crucial to getting the mash to Kentucky Artisan Distillery. We didn't realize until we had done it what a bad idea it was to load 100 gallons of mash into a Ford Ranger and take it on the expressway. So Aiden hung in behind me, who was driving the truck. We weren't even off the Locust Grove property before we realized we were in trouble, but there was nothing else to do with it. We just had to get it.
I watched this thing sloshing around in the back of Brian's truck, and it was a bit unnerving. And then we got on the interstate, And Brian was driving real slow, and I was thinking, this is the only way we're going to be able to do this. And we both put our blinkers on and.
Kept up the communication. You let me know what was coming.
Yep,
and,
probably
so I could stay looking
made
ahead.
a lot of people angry, but we got it there. So we got it there.
Well, then one of the behind the scenes things I know that I liked that happened when we got there was obviously we showed earlier in the film that we got the yeast completely from the Absinthe botanicals here in the Vinoge garden. There was nothing else in there, and so we were a little nervous. And we were going back and forth. It's like, do we want to try to give it any help or anything like that? And we got it to Kentucky Artisan Distillery where they did the distillation. And we're talking, I think it was Cody who was there. And we're talking to him about, we're kicking this around in our head. We want to give this a little help. And he called Jade and said, well, they're asking about this. And I remember hearing Jade say, we're not putting anything in there. It's like, well, discussion's over. It's your distillery and your rules, so we're doing this. And that call that Jade made on the phone really ensured the purity of this product. It was a tense week. Me and Alan were blowing up his phone, just seeing how it was fermenting, just to be sure it was going okay, but it just turned out beautifully.
A year and a half working with Jade now there, he has got tremendous instincts as a distiller, and he loves the historical stuff like this, which I think that was important to him in maintaining the purity of what you're doing. And
right.
So thank you for
thank
all
you.
the time and effort that you all put into this. It's a fantastic tribute to Switzerland County.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm happy.
So, 6 years after the idea, 3 years after we started working on it, it was during COVID, the world was crazy, so it's like, let's make some 1830s absinthe. And here it is.
It's great to taste the final product.
Right.
reaping your rewards here.
Yep.
So,
Might be a group we never get back together in the same place again, but here's
That's right.
to everybody.
Cheers.
congratulations, guys. That's cool.